She called my mother a charity case, right there in front of my entire family, at my mother's own 70th birthday dinner. I didn't say a word that night, but 3 days later she understood exactly what that silence meant. My mother's name is June, not the month. She'll tell you that herself, usually with a small laugh and a wave of her hand, like it doesn't matter. Though I think it does matter to her, the way small things matter to people who spent a lifetime being overlooked. She raised me alone in a 2-bedroom house in rural Kentucky, outside a town so small it doesn't show up on most maps. My father left when I was 4. I don't say that to gather sympathy, I say it because it explains everything about who my mother is. She didn't fall apart. She planted a garden. She took in ironing. She drove 40 minutes each way to clean houses in the next county over, and she never once made me feel like we were struggling, even when we absolutely were. I remember the smell of that house on winter mornings, wood smoke and coffee, and the particular kind of clean that comes from someone who scrubs things by hand because there's no other way. I remember her hands. Rough at the knuckles, always slightly red, but steady. Always steady. I moved to Cincinnati when I was 26, got a degree at night while working days, which took longer than it should have, but got done eventually. By the time I was in my early 40s, I was managing logistics for a regional distribution company. Not glamorous, not wealthy, but solid. Respectable. I bought a house. I paid off my truck. I called my mother every Sunday without fail, and I drove back to Kentucky 4 or 5 times a year, more if I could manage it. That's the life I had when I met my girlfriend. We met at a work event. She was the partner of a colleague, and we ended up talking by the appetizer table for 2 hours while everyone else circulated. She was sharp, funny, dressed well, worked in commercial real estate. Her name was Annette. She had an opinion about everything and wasn't shy about sharing it, which I found attractive at first. Energy like that is magnetic until you understand what's underneath it. We dated for almost 2 years. Moved in together after 14 months. I introduced her to my mother over a video call early on, and my mother was warm, the way she always is. Asking questions, laughing easily, telling a story about the garden. Annette was polite. Attentive, even. I thought it went well. Looking back, I missed things. I always miss things until I can't anymore. There were small comments over the months. About my mother's house. Cozy. Said in a tone that meant something else. About the town. I can't imagine growing up somewhere like that. About my mother's job history. When I mentioned it, a brief pause, a careful nod, the kind you give when you're deciding not to say what you're actually thinking. I noticed these things the way you notice a smell when you first walk into a room. After a few minutes, you stop noticing. That's the danger. My mother turned 70 in March. I wanted to do something real for her, not just a phone call and a card. I booked a private dining room at a restaurant in Lexington, about an hour from her town, somewhere nicer than she would ever take herself. I invited her 2 closest friends, a woman she'd gone to church with for 30 years, and another woman from her neighborhood who'd known her since before I was born. I invited my cousin and his wife. I invited my uncle, my mother's younger brother, who drove up from Tennessee. 9 people total, small, quiet, the kind of evening she would actually enjoy. Annette knew about the dinner for weeks. She said she was looking forward to it. She bought a dress. The drive down was fine. Annette was in a good mood, talking about a property deal she was close to closing. And I let her talk because she was happy, and I liked when she was happy. We got to Lexington in the early afternoon, checked into the hotel, took a walk. It felt like a good weekend. My mother arrived at the restaurant before us. When I walked in and saw her standing there in her good blue cardigan, the one she saves for occasions, something in my chest went tight, the way it does when you love someone and you know how much they've carried. She looked older than she had at Christmas. Not frail, just more clearly herself, the way people get when they stop trying to be anything other than what they are. She hugged me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she leaned back and looked at my face the way only mothers do, checking for something she never quite names. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine," I said. "You always say that." I laughed. She was right. I always say that. Dinner started well. The table was warm, loud in the good way. My uncle telling the story he always tells about the time he and my mother were kids, and she talked him into climbing onto the barn roof and then wouldn't help him down. My mother's friend from church kept touching her arm and saying she couldn't believe she was 70, which made my mother pretend to be modest while clearly being pleased. My cousin's wife had brought a photo album she'd put together, printed pictures, the old kind in one of those plastic sleeve books, and it went around the table slowly, each page causing someone to gasp or laugh or go quiet. Annette sat beside me. She was fine for the first hour, polite, attentive, laughing at the right moments. I noticed her check her phone twice under the table, which I let go. I noticed she didn't eat much of the bread, which was homemade and which my mother had driven an hour to pick up from a specific bakery because she knew I loved it. Small things. The turn came after dessert was ordered. My mother was talking about her garden. She'd expanded it this year. She was trying to grow pole beans for the first time. She'd made a mistake with the spacing and was hoping to salvage it. It was the kind of story she tells the way she tells all stories, without self-consciousness, just following the thread of what actually happened. Her friend from church was asking questions. My uncle was offering advice nobody asked for. It was exactly the kind of conversation I grew up inside. Then Annette leaned toward me and said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Does she talk about the garden every time?" I looked at her. "I'm just asking," she said. "It's sweet. It's a lot of garden content." I didn't respond. I turned back to the table. My mother was still talking, hadn't heard, but my cousin's wife had. I could tell by the way her eyes moved briefly to Annette and then to her own plate. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Annette was bored and that was a conversation for later in private, and the evening was almost done, and my mother was happy and that was what mattered. But then the photo album came around to Annette. She held it for a moment, looking at a page from when I was maybe 10 or 11. My mother in the yard, in her work clothes, standing next to a rusted-out pickup that I remember loving because it meant she could drive me places. My mother is young in the picture, tired-looking in the way of someone who's been up since 5, but smiling, genuinely smiling, at whoever was holding the camera. Annette looked at the photo for a moment and then said, "She looks like someone who's had a hard life." Not said to me, said to the table, said in the kind of voice people use when they think they're being compassionate, but they're actually just naming something they look down on. The table went quiet. My mother heard it. I watched her hear it. The small pause in her expression, something recalibrating behind her eyes, and then the practiced smile that she's been wearing her whole life when someone makes her feel small and she refuses to give them the satisfaction of seeing it land. "She has," my mother said simply, and then she looked back at her dessert. My uncle set his fork down. Annette seemed to realize something had shifted. She made a small sound, "I only meant," and then stopped. I stood up. Not dramatically. I excused myself, told the table I'd be right back, and I walked Annette out of the dining room and into the hallway by the restrooms where there was no one. "That was unkind," I said. I know what you were doing. I need you to understand that everyone at that table also knows what you were doing." She looked at me with an expression I'd seen before but never fully understood until that moment. A kind of surprised indignation. The look of someone who has said thoughtless things for years without real consequence and is suddenly encountering one. "I wasn't trying to be rude," she said. "I know," I said. "That's the part that bothers me most." I went back inside. Annette returned to the table a few minutes later. She was quiet for the rest of the evening. My mother was gracious to her. My mother is almost constitutionally incapable of being anything other than gracious, and the dinner ended warmly because my mother willed it to, because that's what she does. In the car on the way back to the hotel, Annette apologized, briefly in the way of someone checking a box. She said she hadn't realized how it would sound. She said she hadn't realized how it would sound. She said she was sorry if she'd made anyone uncomfortable. I said okay. I said very little else that night. What I didn't say was that I'd been thinking, sitting at that table after I came back from the hallway, about a conversation I'd had 3 weeks earlier with my cousin. He'd called me about something else entirely, a family matter with my uncle, and near the end of the call, almost as an aside, he'd mentioned something Annette had said to his wife at a cookout in the fall. Something about my mother's house and how he hoped I wasn't planning to have her live with us someday because that would be a lot. My cousin had hesitated before telling me. He said he wasn't sure if it was worth mentioning. He said his wife had been bothered by it for months. I had filed that away in the place where I put things I don't want to look at directly. At the birthday dinner, I took it back out. I spent the next 2 days quieter than usual. Annette noticed but attributed it to tiredness. I drove my mother home on Sunday morning. Annette stayed at the hotel, said she had calls to make, and my mother and I sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee the way we have for 30 years, and she didn't say one word about the dinner. She asked me about work. She showed me what she was doing with the pole beans. She sent me home with a container of soup I didn't ask for and a look that told me she saw more than she was saying. In the car on the way back to Cincinnati, I made a decision. I didn't make it angrily. That's the thing I want to be clear about, because people assume these moments come with shouting or slammed doors or dramatic declarations. This one didn't. It came quietly, somewhere between Lexington and the highway, with the radio off and the flat winter fields going by on both sides. I made it the way you make any decision that's been building for a long time. Not all at once, but like a string that finally reaches the end of the spool. I moved out 2 weeks later. Annette was away for a work conference, and I used the time to take what was mine and leave a note, not a cruel note, a clear one. I told her I'd thought hard about the kind of life I wanted and about the kind of person I wanted to share it with, and that I didn't think we were suited to each other in the ways that mattered most. I told her there was no need to make it complicated. I told her I wished her well and meant it. She called 6 times over the next 2 days. The first few messages were confused, then hurt, then sharp in a way that made me feel like I'd made the right call. The last one was quieter. She said she wanted to understand what had happened. I called her back once, and we talked for 20 minutes, and I said what I'd said in the note, calmly and without cruelty, and when I hung up, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt like myself. There were practical things to sort out. We'd been living in my house. I owned it outright, had for years, so the housing situation was straightforward. We had a joint account for household expenses that we untangled without drama. She kept some furniture she'd brought. I kept everything else. My lawyer, a sharp woman who'd helped me with my house purchase, and who I trusted completely, said it was among the cleaner separations she'd seen for a 2-year relationship. 3 months passed. I got used to the quiet in the house. I called my mother more often, not out of duty but because I wanted to. I drove to Kentucky in April and helped her with the garden. The pole beans came in fine. She'd figured out the spacing. One Sunday evening she called me. She'd been talking to her friend from church, the one who'd been at the birthday dinner, and her friend had mentioned running into my cousin's wife, who had apparently told her something she thought my mother should know. It was secondhand, through 2 people, and I want to be honest about that, but what it amounted to was this. Annette had, at some point during our relationship, my cousin's wife thought it was around the 1-year mark, spoken to a mutual friend in a way that suggested she'd seen the house in Kentucky and had some thoughts about it, about what it would mean financially if my mother needed long-term care, about whether I had money set aside, about what might come to me, eventually, from the property, the house and the land it sat on, which I had looked up once out of curiosity, and which was worth considerably more than it appeared, because of where it sat and because of the way property values had moved in that county over the past decade. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not going to say I was shocked. I think some part of me had understood, in the way you understand things you'd rather not, that there was a calculation somewhere underneath all of it, the comments, the patience she showed in some moments, and the contempt that slipped out in others, the particular way she'd looked at that photograph. What I felt, mostly, was tired, and then, after the tiredness, something lighter, because here is what she didn't know. She didn't know that my mother had, 6 months earlier, quietly and without mentioning it to me, signed a trust, not a complicated one, My mother's lawyer, a man she'd known for 20 years who'd done her simple estate planning for free as a favor, had helped her structure it. The property and whatever came from it would go directly into a trust for me, bypassing any claim that a spouse or partner might make in the event of a death or a legal challenge. My mother had done it because she'd been reading things, she told me later. Because she paid attention, because she was not, despite what some people assumed, someone who'd spent her whole life being hard up without learning anything from it. When I asked her why she hadn't told me at the time, she looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "I didn't want to make assumptions about your relationship." I laughed. She smiled. "But I did want to be careful," she said. My mother cleaned other people's houses for 15 years. She grew food in a backyard garden for 30. She raised a son alone without asking anyone for a thing. And she did it while being the kind of person who shows up when someone needs something and doesn't keep a ledger about it. She is not a charity case. She never was. She is the reason I know the difference between a person who loves you and a person who is calculating what you're worth. I'm 54 years old. I'm not in a hurry about anything. I have a house I own and a job I'm good at and a mother who is growing pole beans and going to church and telling the same stories to the same people who have been laughing at them for decades. On Sunday mornings when I call, she answers on the second ring. She always has. That's the life. That's the whole of it. And it turns out that's enough, more than enough, once you stop letting someone make you feel like it isn't. I've thought a lot about what Annette actually saw when she looked at that photograph of my mother. A tired woman in work clothes standing next to a rusted truck. That was all she saw, and I think that's the thing that stays with me most, not the cruelty of what she said, but the smallness of it, the way a person can look at an entire life and reduce it to a surface. My mother never asked anyone to admire her for what she went through. She didn't talk about the hard years the way people do when they want credit. She just kept going. That kind of persistence, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't keep score, is something I didn't fully understand when I was younger. I thought strength was loud. I thought it looked like confidence in a room, like the way Annette carried herself into every conversation, already certain she was the most prepared person in it. It took me a long time to see that the quieter version is usually the one that holds. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on a resume. My mother had it. She read people. She understood things about money and property and human nature that she'd learned not from any classroom but from decades of paying careful attention while other people assumed she wasn't paying attention at all. The trust she'd set up 6 months before the birthday dinner without telling me, without making a fuss about it. That wasn't luck. That was someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and had decided, quietly and without drama, to be prepared for it. I think about the cause and the effect of all of it now. Annette's behavior didn't happen in isolation. It was a pattern. Small dismissals, careful calculations, a certain kind of contempt that leaked out when she thought no one important was watching. And it produced a result that was completely consistent with what it was. When you treat people like they don't matter, you eventually make a mistake that costs you the thing you were actually trying to protect. In Annette's case, she was so focused on what she thought my mother's world was worth that she couldn't see what my mother herself was worth. And that blindness was the thing that undid her. I'm not angry about any of it. I want to be clear about that. What I feel when I sit with the whole story now is something more like gratitude, which I know sounds strange. But I think the dinner, and what Annette said, and all of it, pushed me toward a decision I should have made earlier. And it reminded me of something I already knew but had let myself forget, that character is the only thing that actually holds up over time, not status, not calculation, not the careful management of impressions. Just whether you're decent to people when there's nothing to gain from it. My mother was decent to Annette for the rest of that evening, after the comment, after the silence at the table. That's not weakness. That takes more out of you than anger does. It takes a kind of moral backbone that most people never develop because it's never been required of them. I drove home from Kentucky that Sunday with a container of soup on the passenger seat and a decision already forming somewhere I couldn't quite name yet. I think the soup is the detail I keep coming back to. She knew I hadn't eaten enough. She wasn't thinking about trusts or property values or what I was going to do next. She was just thinking about whether her son had eaten. That's the whole thing, really. That's everything.